Sopranopreneur Season 1, Episode 8. Next, we cut to one of my favorite scenes, which is Chris and Uncle Paulie here having a heart-to-heart, right? Paulie goes over to Chris's house. He's on the computer, still trying to write that script that he just can't get out. And with Chris, nothing he does is 100%. And Chris just can't find happiness in what he's doing, I think because he's not giving things 100%. If he could focus on one thing and do one thing right and give that 100%, maybe then he would be happy. Maybe then he would be in a good place, but he's not. He's all over the place. And Paulie basically says to him, look, kid, you got to start to accept who you are, what you got, and what you do. Look at me. I appreciate the things I have in life. I appreciate the money, the clothes. I appreciate the simple things. And he's found this like almost level of contentness, right? This level of happiness. He doesn't want to be the boss of the family. He's happy in his role. He's in a leadership role. He's middle management. Him and Georgie kind of have this contentness because they've accepted what they're doing, but they're in the role that they love and they're able to fulfill the mission and vision of the organization they're with. It's a very thin line in business though, right? Because I think in business, we always say we want to be challenged to strive for greatness or strive to be better, but we have to balance that with focus because we're always striving to be better, but we're not really getting better at anything. And we're going from one thing to another, and we're maybe not focusing on going deep. Sometimes in business, it's better to go to deep and find the one thing that you're good at and be successful, because this is where Chris is not finding that, but he's also trying 1,000,001 different things. He's trying to be a hitman. He's trying to be a thief. He's trying to be a writer. He's trying to be all these different things, and none of them are working out for him. All right. Welcome. Sopranopreneur Season 1, Episode 8. Excited to be here. The Legend of Tennessee Moltisanti. Obviously focusing on Christopher. Looking forward to another great episode. Once again, thank you to everybody who has been listening and subscribing and leaving feedback. I appreciate that. So let's dive right into today's episode. And obviously, this is a great episode because it focuses on two things that I really enjoyed throughout the entire series here. One is Christopher. I think he's just an interesting character. I think everything that he's done is interesting, played by Michael Imperioli. And then also the other concept that we're going to be looking at here is the FBI and how it's influencing Tony's life, and him possibly getting arrested and assassinated and everything. We talked in the last episode, the Livia AJ conversation, what a big impact that has. And we're going to continue to see that as we move here into episode 8. And from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the thing I love about this is we start to see passion for what we do and love, and passion for what we work on. And that's going to be a key concept here, because we see a lot of different people, not just Christopher. We see Georgie, we see Tony, we see a lot of people in their different roles, especially Paulie, who I think throughout the series, and this is probably one of the episodes where Paulie looks like he's got his shit together. Looks like he's really figured life out. Where really the rest of the series, he's kind of this like loose cannon, old school guy, maybe doesn't know where he fits in. But earlier on here in the series, I think Paulie is, believe it or not, the stable guiding light. So we're going to deal with all those concepts today, and kind of the love and passion for what you do in business, and kind of accepting your role and what you're going to do, but then also the idea of mistakes, which we open up with here. We open with the dream sequence, and David Chase, obviously a genius in creating this series, and the way that he has recorded dream sequences throughout this series is just amazing. And this one is, I believe, one of the first ones that we see, and well, not really that we see from the series, because Tony has had a few about Dr. Melfi already, but this is one that we see with Chris, and I think this one's very cinematic. So I really just enjoyed this. And Chris is obviously being haunted, I said that wrong, haunted by Email Cola, who was one of his first kills, one of the first ones that he's done. And we saw that Chris kind of did this too, to take initiative. He thought it would get him higher up, it would get him made, it would get him his button, it would sort of get him closer with Tony and everybody, and it hasn't. And we learned that this is one of Christopher's first murders. We're going to see him commit a few more here throughout the series, but this is definitely one of his first. And this guy's haunting him in his dreams. And we see that here. They're back at the deli, which is where he killed him, at Satriali's. And he's basically telling him, hey, you screwed up when you killed me. You made a mistake. You're going to get caught, right? And this is haunting Christopher. And this is going to kind of set a tone for a lot of things we see Chris deal with here. And the Legend of Tennessee Moltisanti, Chris is kind of loose cannon. He is kind of a cowboy, but he's also loyal in what he's doing and where he wants to be. So Chris wakes up from that dream, obviously a little bit spooked, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later when he talks to Paulie and Big Pussy about it as well. But then we cut to a wedding, and we see Larry Boy kind of welcoming everyone there, Tony getting there, and a wedding for Italians is a big thing. If you've ever been to a New York or New Jersey wedding, they are something else. They are like next level. I have a lot of family up there, and we've gone to a couple of them, and they're just amazing, right? So first off, if you don't live in the New York, New Jersey area, sure, you may have been to a cool wedding, but there's nothing like a New York, New Jersey Italian wedding, right? There's also a great play, Tony and Tina's Italian Wedding. It's actually an interactive play. I went to it when I was a kid, and that was a blast as well. But an Italian wedding's a big deal, right? And people usually give a boost, or they put money in an envelope. That's usually the way that you give a gift. And we know a lot of the guys here that are in the mob, they want to look big, right? So the more money you put in the envelope, the more big you look. Once again, what does success look like, right? We've talked about that a lot. But one of the things they find out, and Tony finds out from Larry Boy, is that there are indictments being handed down from the FBI. He's got a guy that owes him money, and he's got a guy, and he found out he knows this girl. She does the subpoenas, and that's how these guys found out about this. So the idea is, hey, the FBI is coming. They're going to be handing out indictments and who it's going to come from. Now, keep in mind, this is the whole reason Tony put Junior in the leadership position. So Tony, as a good leader, actually put Junior ahead of him as the lightning rod for something just like this. So Tony, in some ways, has to sort of stay back a little bit so that Junior can take that heat, right? So that Junior can take sort of the problem, if you will, of the FBI investigation that's coming. But he also has to play it cool and show that he is the leader of his people and that he's the leader of everybody here as well. So he has to sort of manage both of those things as he's going along throughout this process. And one of the things that everybody says is, they're kind of sitting there and saying, hey, what should we do? How should we put this together? And Tony basically says, hey, Junior, says what he thinks they should do, kind of asks Junior. And everybody goes back to asking Tony. It's kind of a little bit of a power struggle. Junior says, hey, we should just sort of, lay back and do nothing. And then everybody's like, well, Tony, what do you think? Which shows that Tony's clearly in charge, and Junior obviously gets upset about this, which is going to continue to play on this Junior-Tony power struggle, this Libya upset, the psychiatry thing. All this is going to play, fall into play. So like I said, these small instances that seem like they don't mean anything, or they're not really that big of a deal, they are a big deal. They're a big deal because they're having an impact on the business, which is like we've talked about throughout the Sopranopreneur. The little things we do can have a big impact on our business. The little things we do can have a big impact on who we are. And Tony suggests kind of spring cleaning. Maybe if we go to our houses, get rid of anything that if the FBI found it, we'd be concerned, whether it's documents, jewelry, guns, stolen merchandise, money, cash, whatever it may be. And I think it's interesting, too, because in theory, the FBI are the good guys. In theory, you as the person watching The Sopranos should be cheering for the FBI, right? Like, hey, wow, they're gonna arrest the bad guys. Here comes the FBI. But actually, it's flipped, and this is once again the genius in how the show is written, where the good guys are actually portrayed as the bad guys, and the bad guys are portrayed as the good guys. So you're rooting for Tony and them and everybody here, basically, Pussy, Chris, everybody to kind of get rid of the things that they need so that they don't get in trouble. Which is interesting, right? Because I think in business too, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, are we rooting for the good guys or the bad guys, right? What are we doing? Who is the good guy and who is the bad guy? Sometimes that's not easy to see in your business. Sometimes it's not easy to see a good customer from a bad customer just right up front. It takes time to figure that out by working with them, or a good client or a bad client, or a good employee or a bad employee. We're not always clear on who's good and who's bad. And we see this here with the FBI. They're supposed to be the good guys, but I always thought it was fascinating to show how they painted them in the other light. So we know this is happening. We see everybody getting rid of stuff. Some people, Pussy's burning documents. Tony's getting rid of the jewelry with Carmela. And Carmela, too, while she seems frustrated, she seems at peace with the process as well. And she seems at peace with how things are going and what they look like. So I think it's interesting, sort of that balance, if you will, or that sort of divide that they have in sort of going through and doing this. Next, we cut to the scene where Chris is writing a script on the computer. Obviously, this takes place in the, basically the late 90s, early 2000s. So he's got this really old computer. It makes this noise, which for me brought back a lot of memories of working on an old PC and working in Word when it wasn't what it is today, how easy and user-friendly it is. Even in typing the show notes, I was laughing because I was like, man, we've come a long way in being able to, old school, you would have been able to put a picture in there and spacing and all this stuff. It was a lot of work. And I made this little bloop, bloop, bloop noise, man. That brought back some memories for me, but I digress. But we see Chris writing this and he gets frustrated with the technology, right? Well, the technology is not working. I'm trying to do the script. It's not letting me focus on what I need to focus on. And I think the big thing in business is, I think it's important to talk about this, right? Technology, new, older, and different, shouldn't get in the way of the process of what we're doing to be successful. I know a lot of people too are talking in business right now about AI and all these other things. Is it good? Is it bad? I did a post on Sopranopreneur Instagram where I posted, what did Tony and the guys thought of AI or thought of it? And when it comes to this technology, and it's funny, even Christopher writing this script, he probably could have used AI to help him write it and would have been able to flush it out much quicker. But he gets frustrated. Adriana obviously comes in and helps him. But Adriana also says something. I love how passionate you are about this. I love that you're doing this. I've never seen you work this hard. So one of the things that I think is interesting is she sees that this is something Christopher loves. And because she loves it, he sees him being passionate about it. Now, keep this in mind because we're going to come back to this in a little bit. Just because someone loves something and it looks like they're passionate about it, doesn't mean they're doing a good job. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people to see in business. That if they're not passionate about something, well, that was interesting. I'm not sure where all those balloons came from. If they're not passionate about something, are they doing a good job? If they're not passionate about something, can they do a good job, right? But if they are passionate about it, we automatically expect that they're doing a good job. And that's not always true. I think we have to define what a good job or what's successful or doing things right is. And if we don't define that and we don't understand what that picture is, we get very confused and say, hey, just because somebody loves something doesn't mean that they're doing a good job at it. And if you think that, hey, well, if I love something, and you see, I've seen people that are extremely passionate about things, but they're not doing a good job, right? Because there's loving something and there's doing the job, and those are really two totally different things. And we're going to come back to that concept as well. We also see too everyone watching the news about the indictment. So we found out about him at the wedding. It was kind of secretive. Now the secret's kind of out. It's actually on national news. They're covering it, and they're talking about the power struggles within the family, which Tony understands. So once again, now we're kind of throwing salt on that wound that we saw at the wedding, where Junior and Tony had this power struggle. They're talking about that on the news. The other thing is Chris wants to be this bad mafioso recognized. He also wants to be recognized in the indictments, and we're going to see how no one thinks he really is, and neither does Chris, and it's because he hasn't sort of achieved that rank. And we see them mentioned on the news story Brendan Fallone, which you remember Mikey Palmisi killed in an earlier episode. And with that, it really is something that I think is interesting that Chris wants to be perceived as successful. Now, Brendan Fallone, he's dead, and they're perceiving him as a successful mobster, and Chris really wants that. Well, Chris would have had to die to get that recognition. Is that something that he really wants? And somewhat foreshadowing here. If you've seen the whole Soprano series, you know kind of the foreshadowing that's going on with that. And it talks about, to me, it really signals in legacy, right? And what legacy is. Um, a lot of times, too, I think when we pass away, we don't realize how we were recognized and how great we were. And we don't pay attention to that, right? And I think sometimes hearing how we were when we pass away, the truth really comes out on all levels. Obviously, the good initially, but the bad as well. So I think it's important, too, to realize every little thing you do has an impact, and you may not realize the legacy you're creating while you're here and afterwards. I think it's important that we're focusing on both of those. And that leads really to Dr. Melfi's family. Now we see Dr. Melfi. We've traditionally seen her um, in the home setting a few times, but really we've seen her only in working with Tony, and we've seen her a little bit on a date. But now we see her with her family. And Dr. Melfi, obviously ending in a vowel, and that's why Tony chose her to be his therapist, is Italian. She is someone who's Italian, and she's someone that Tony wanted to work with because she was Italian. But this is a different type of Italian family. They're not in the mob. They are your American dream family, if you will. They have ancestors that came from Italy. They've assimilated, and now they're successful in America. Right? That's the American dream, and they've achieved that. And they kind of are talking at the dinner about Tony being a patient. They're not talking about Tony specifically because of doctor-patient confidentiality. And Melfi says she doesn't want to dive into it. She kind of slipped up and said something she shouldn't have, but she really doesn't want to dive into that. But they're talking about how this negative mob stereotype is not good, right? Which is ironic. They're talking about TV shows and movies and things like that. Which, once again, the irony of this is these guys, once again, in some ways too, if you're a big fan of the show, you almost see these guys as being the negative bad guys, which really they're the good guys, right? So I think it's once again that duplicity that we see here, and it goes, kind of with the idea of marketing and messaging, right? How do we convey the message of what we want? We know the mob. I think they even say it made up at one point like maybe 5% of all Italians have connections to organized crime, which is such a small number. But when you hear Italian, it's one of the first things that comes to people's mind. That's marketing, right? It just happens to be the messaging and things that are put out, and what's been done there, the food and things like that. So we also have to, we may have the brand that we want, but the brand that we're recognized for may be something very different. I was talking about this with someone the other day. I'm an outsourced COO. I'm doing the Sopranopreneur because I work with entrepreneurs and I want to talk about that. But when I go out in public, most people, while they know that I am a consultant and an outsourced COO, they recognize me for the Italian things, or they'll talk about the Sopranopreneurs, or they'll talk about cigars, or they'll talk about steaks, other things that maybe aren't related to the core of my business and what I do. It maybe makes up 5% of who I am, but it's something that people recognize because of the content put out, the things I do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to frame that as being something bad, because what that does for me is it allows me to open up conversations, and it allows me to sit down with people and say, hey, do you want to go grab a cigar? And then we talk business, or do you want to go grab a nice Italian meal? And then we talk business. Or they'll tell me, I can't tell you how many people I've got messages from about this. Oh, I just started watching The Sopranos, never watched it. Or now that you put this out, I'm rewatching The Sopranos and seeing it through a whole new lens. So the things that we do too with our brand, it always doesn't have to be business focused. I see too a lot of times people, and it's kind of the idea of how do we break a stereotype, right? I see a lot of people putting out content all the time about what they do for a living, and maybe just talking about their business on social media, but they're not sharing any of their personal life and who they are and who they want people to know who they are. When you do that balance and you market yourself in a right way, people are able to see who you are. And this is obviously, talk of this with the Italian thing and trying to break down those stereotypes. But I think it's very interesting, and that determines how we feel about ourselves, I think, right? Because it always feels good, right? It feels good for me when I walk up into a room and someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, oh man, love that cigar, that video you did." It feels good to do that. But it's a connection that I make with people. And I'm able to have that connection. They're able to see that realness, and it also makes you feel more comfortable, which leads to the next scene, right? Chris is not comfortable with who he is. He doesn't know. Does he want to be a May guy in the mafia? Does he want to be a screenwriter? Like, he doesn't know who he wants to be, and this is sort of playing into where he's at and what he does. And we see Tony calls Chris. He's taking a nap, and he says, "Hey, guys are all down here. We know the indictment's coming down. We got to sweep for bugs, but come down here and help out. But before you do that, pick up some Shuidel from the pastry shop, right?" So he goes in the pastry shop. There's a bunch of people there. There's a long line, and he takes his number. And everyone else is getting served. He's waiting his turn. So he's following the rules here, which is interesting. And then right when his number's about to come up, a gentleman walks through the door who is actually Vito Spatafora, but he's playing a different character, Gino, in this scene. And he comes up and the guy goes to serve him because obviously he's respected. He knows him. He's his friend. And he's going to let this guy skip Chris. But Chris is not having that at all. And he's pissed. And he wants to be taken care of. And the kid behind the counter, being sort of a cocky young kid, is like, "No, fuck you. I'll do whatever I want." And he's going to help out, the Vito here. I'm going to call him Vito because that's who he ends up being. And Chris gets upset. So he tells Gino or Vito to leave. And he locks the door and he pulls out a gun and points at the kid. And now his attitude changes completely. The kid, right? Because now he's scared, where he wasn't scared of Chris before. And Chris is like, "Well, wait a second. Like, I want to understand this. Like, help me understand. What do I look? Do I look soft? Do I look like a punk? Do I look like somebody you could take advantage of?" So I think it's interesting because Chris kind of does the research of, "Hey, why don't you understand my brand?" Right? Why don't you understand who I am and what I do? Why don't you understand that I'm just as tough as Gino and I'm with a crew as well? Why don't you know that about me? And Chris is upset, and I think he's not upset with this kid necessarily. He's upset with the circumstances of his life, that no one, with Tony and everyone in the family, no one really respects him the way he wants to be respected. Out in the community, he's not getting that respect. On the news with these indictments, he's not getting that respect. They're for loan, and obviously he gets with this kid. He kind of does, which is ironic. He was in Goodfellas. He played Spider. Very similar scene here where he shoots the kid in the foot, and he basically leaves with the pastry. So kind of a nod to Chris's previous role in Goodfellas. Not sure if that was intentional or unintentional, but that's what he does. And it's kind of like, "Hey, why don't you respect who I am?" And then we see Chris show up with the pastries, which he obviously had to work very hard for. And Tony's like, "Where you been? I called you an hour ago." And he throws them on the table. And even Paulie's like, "Hey, the sweet Adele, what are you doing? Why are you knocking that on the floor?" So just a great classic funny scene right all around. Um, and what we see is that Chris really isn't respecting. He tells him to go with Georgie and sweep for bugs in the bathroom. When Chris definitely feels like he shouldn't be doing that. He feels like that's below him. And Georgie, who's the bartender there, he's kind of like he's kind of an absent-minded guy, but just kind of a happy-go-lucky guy. He's like, "Man, I hope the guys are okay." And Chris is like, "Well, what about me?" He goes, "Well, you're fine. Nothing will happen to you." And he kind of says things too much, I think, in the truth of what he should say. But the idea of this is that Georgie is happy with what he does, even though he's in a position that may seem low to Chris. Georgie is just happy to be there, happy to be with who he's with, and enjoys what he's doing. But Chris feels this is below him, and he's frustrated why he's going to do the job. Why Georgie's literally on his hands and knees in a dirty bathroom, and he's kind of happy. Chris is standing up there and just looking at the soap dispenser for bugs, not really doing anything too dirty, and he's upset. So sometimes there's finding happiness in the niche of what we do, or finding happiness in the simple things in our life, right? That's the key. That's what's important. That's what we got to look at as we're going through there. Next, we see Tony and Carmela go to the nursing home. Carmela wants to get Livia out of there, and Tony's actually going into the nursing home to hide the guns and jewelry and money so that the FBI doesn't steal that. And this is important because he's doing this, and in some ways, he said he was putting his mom in there for her benefit, but now it's for his benefit. And we're going to see, we know Livia is not happy to be in there. She knows Tony's in therapy. Junior and her are talking. We know Junior's not happy with the power struggle, and now Tony's using her to his benefit. She doesn't know that the stuff's in there, but if she does come across it, we don't know if she ever does come across it actually, but we know that could kind of cause a little bit of turmoil in a situation there. So we see Tony in therapy, and he's letting Dr. Melfi know, "Hey, with all this indictment stuff on the news, I may disappear and I may not be around." And that's an important thing, the message, because we're going to see that in a little bit. But next we cut to one of my favorite scenes which is Chris and Uncle Paulie here having a heart to heart, right? Paulie goes over to Chris's house. He's on the computer, still trying to write that script that he just can't get out. And remember what Adriana said. She said, "It's so good to see you do something that you're passionate about and that you love. I feel like you're doing a great job with this." When we really see Chris isn't doing a great job with this. He didn't do a great job with getting this Fidel. If you remember the previous episode where he stole the watches out of the FedEx truck, killing Email Cola, he hasn't been doing a good job. And with Chris, this is kind of nothing he does is 100%. And there's a saying, Jesse Itzler, one of my favorite entrepreneurs to follow, he says, the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And there's a lot of entrepreneurs too online that'll argue whether or not that statement's true. But this is true for Chris, right? The way he does one thing, he doesn't do everything 100%. He acts like he's all in it. Even when Georgie called him when he was writing the script before, he says, "I'm writing." Like, he jumps up to answer the phone to tell people he's writing. But why even jump up and say that, right? If you're really into this. And Chris just can't find happiness in what he's doing. I think because he's not giving things 100%. If he could focus on one thing and do one thing right and give that 100%, maybe then he would be happy. Maybe then he would be in a good place. But he's not. He's all over the place. He's doing a million and one different things, and he's not happy. And he tells Paulie he's not happy and how he's feeling. And Paulie basically says to him, "Look, kid, and this is where I love, this is probably one of Tony Sirico, Paulie Wanda's greatest scenes in the entire episode. He said, 'Look, kid, sometimes that's his life.' He goes, 'You got to start to accept who you are, what you got, and what you do. Look at me.' He says, 'I was went overseas, fought in the war for a while, spent a few years in jail, and now here I am. But I appreciate the things I have in life. I appreciate the money, the clothes. I appreciate the simple things.' And he's found this like almost level of contentness, right? This level of happiness. And we don't see anyone else has that right now. And it's interesting for Paulie because I think everything's kind of set up for him with where he wants it to be. He doesn't want to be the boss of the family. He's happy in his role. He's in a leadership role. He's middle management. Him and Georgie kind of have this contentness because they've accepted what they're doing, but they're in the role that they love and they're able to fulfill the mission and vision of the organization they're with. So there's something to say about that happiness. Now, it's a very thin line in business, though, right? Because I think in business, we always say we want to be challenged to strive for greatness or strive to be better. But at the end of the day, we have to balance that with focus because we're always striving to be better, but we're not really getting better at anything. And we're going from one thing to another, and we're maybe not focusing on going deep, right? A lot of people want to go wide instead of deep. Sometimes in business, it's better to go to deep and find the one thing that you're good at and be successful, because this is where Chris is not finding that, but he's also trying a million and one different things. He's trying to be a hitman. He's trying to be a thief. He's trying to be a writer. He's trying to be all these different things, and none of them are working out for him. So that's where it's kind of, I think important for him to focus on the one things. And you see too, in the next scene, it cuts to that conversation. You have a conversation with Pussy, and Pussy even says to him, "Here's this guy, you put a moonroof in the back of his head. Why is he going to come to a dream and give you advice? Why is he going to come in a dream and tell you where to go?" Which is actually sound advice. And Chris gets great advice from Paulie and Pussy. And if he would have listened, he may have found the happiness and contentment he's looking for, but he didn't listen to the advice he was getting from his leaders. And if we don't listen to the advice we're getting from our leaders, we're doomed to fail. And what does he do? He goes with Georgie to dig up the body, and this ends up being a disaster, right? And we see too that Chris and Tony basically get together, and Tony tells them, "Why are you doing this? Why are you digging up a body? This looks like somebody that might want to get caught. This looks like somebody that might want to do something on their own." So I think it's finding that balance in that, and finding that balance in that direction of how are you doing that? How are you going through those things? The next thing that we see and the next thing that we look at is we go from Chris digging up the body of the guy he killed to Dr. Melfi and Tony having a discuss, or Dr. Melfi actually and her ex-husband discussing the land that they purchased. And they're discussing the land they purchased and saying, and once again, keep in mind, these guys are the Italian background, which is ironic. Chris is just digging up a body somewhere, and now here's Dr. Melfi and her ex-husband. They need to sell this lot of land. And it's a discussion about, kind of Italian Americans and their history. Once again, Tony comes up, but indirectly and not directly. They're having this conversation about the problems they're having and the things that are going on. And it's really interesting to see this, and interesting to see this, once again, these two versions of the Italian American dream, the Tony and the Christopher, and then the Dr. Melfi and her ex-husband, on what do they need to do with this land. And like I said, it's the idea of vision and building. They thought they bought this as a married couple. They thought they were going to build a house on this land. They thought they were going to do something with it. And now they're just kind of getting rid of it to sustain the lifestyle that they have. Same thing with Tony and all the jewelry and the guns and everything. Here's something that they thought was great. Now the FBI is coming, they got to hide it. So sometimes the goals and the things that we set for us and the success and the riches that we get don't always line up with where we're going and where we want to be. Next thing we see too, the FBI finally does show up at Tony's house to do the raid, which everybody knows is coming. Tony knows, Carmela knows, the kids kind of know but don't know, and they're doing their job. And once again, you're kind of rooting here for Tony and Carmela because the FBI looks like the bad guy, which is fascinating to me. We also see Agent Grasso, who drops a plate. and Tony gets mad at him. They kind of have a confrontation. Here's an Italian that kind of, how could you go against and become an FBI agent? You're screwing us over, and they're getting really upset. And after the raid is done, we cut to a scene of everybody having dinner. Tony, Carmela, AJ, Meadow, and they're talking about what went on. And Carmela's kind of like, well, they're just doing their job. And Tony even says, yeah, I understand they're doing their job, but why do they have to do it that way? Once again, they're painting him as the bad guys. And Tony even says the Italian guy, he's the worst of them all. And they also talk too about how Italians have gotten robbed of the things that they've done. And once again, this is, if we go to the conversation Dr. Melfi had with her family about how the mob is stealing the identity of Italians, these guys now, Tony and the mob, who's what Dr. Melfi had the problem with, they're talking about how historically, though, the Italians got robbed of, credit Anthony Mariucci for creating the telephone, right? A lot of these different things, everybody, Christopher Columbus, which we know is going to come up in later episodes, all these Italians that were robbed of things. So once again, it's important too that we got to understand in business, we may do things, the identity and messaging that we have, right? That goes to the Dr. Melfi conversation. Here, the work that we do, someone else may take our idea or try to take credit for it. That's why it's important, I think, too, and especially in today's world, to put things out there on social media so people know what you're doing and they know how you're building it and they know how you put it together. So those structures and sort of building that out, I think, are the most important thing as we go along and as we look at these things. Next, we get to Tony. He goes to Dr. Melfi's office, and we talk about how he missed an appointment. One of the things that we see here, too, in that missed appointment is she's going to make him pay for that missed appointment. She's going to make him pay for it because he missed it. And it shows how, hey, it's nothing personal. It's just business. But Tony gets upset. And keep in mind here, too, this is a very thin line in business, right? We all know that everybody wants to do business with people they know, like, and trust. This is why Tony even had Macasian looking into Dr. Melfi. Tony said he loved her. And even Tony, I think Tony acts this way in his business, which I think is really interesting. He wouldn't let anyone get away with like not paying him the money that they owed. But she does, right? He does. And we kind of go down this direction. And Tony gets really upset about this. He throws money on the table at her. And, is Dr. Melfi right or wrong in doing this and charging him for the missed session? Even though he said it may happen, it's a side effect of his condition. He says, it's a thin line, right? So I think in business too, we do business with people we know, like, and trust. And it's important to build those relationships, but it's also important to set those boundaries in your business as well. I don't care whether it's somebody, from your accountant to the guy that cuts your lawn, whoever, to a friend that owns a restaurant. You shouldn't expect discounts from your friends just because they're your friends, right? And even if you're doing business with somebody, just because you get to know them or like them more, doesn't mean you have to give them a discount. You could keep the business relationship one way and the friendship relationship another. And that's a very thin line to balance. So we're going to see that line throughout the series here, especially in the mob, because this is a mafia type situation. Next, we cut to, once again, a very pivotal scene as well. Junior and Livia, there's kind of a comedy show going on in the nursing home. And Livia and Junior are talking about everything going on. And Tony and Junior's like, well, don't be too hard on Tony. He's got a lot going on. And Livia's like, yeah, I'm sure he probably talks to his psychiatrist about it. So once again, remember what I talked about in the last episode, that bomb that AJ dropped. Now, Livia is passing the bomb along, if you will, and dropping it on the Junior. So the idea of the differentiation between these two and the idea of the differentiation in this messaging and how this communication happens and how these things go on, this is setting up a downfall, setting up Tony for a bad situation, because Junior doesn't like the fact that he's going to therapy either. Now, where AJ did it sort of like, I think, accidentally and didn't realize he was putting his dad in harm's way, I think Livia, well, we all know Livia knows what she's doing and she's putting Tony in harm's way. So once again, it's those little things that we do. We have to be very careful with our reputation and how we protect it and what happens. And we're going to see the snowball that happens from this. We sort of get to the end of the episode here, where the indictments are being handed out. And Chris gets a phone call that the indictments are happening. And that they're going on, and he gets all excited and he jumps up and because he was mentioning them from his mom, and we see him jump up and go out of bed. Then it cuts to a scene of Dr. Melfi and her family in therapy, and we're going to get back to this Chris thing, where they're talking about the mob situation. Once again, it's these stereotypes that they don't like, the reputation of Italians that they don't like, and they're kind of asking the question of, well, then how do we break these stereotypes? How do we break down this sort of black cloud that's hanging over us? And obviously the therapist is kind of mocking the situation, not helping. Her ex-husband wants her to get rid of the patient, and her son could care less. He's sort of in the way. At the end of the day, I think everybody's looking to point a different finger here, which I think is interesting. But I think the business lesson here to learn is responsibility ultimately falls on you, the business owner, right? The decisions, whether or not there's consequences for Dr. Melfi or not, are going to ultimately fall on her. So you may get advice from trusted advisors. She's getting it from this therapist. Chris got it from Pussy and Paulie. But ultimately, you have to make the decisions, and the decisions you make are going to affect the outcomes of your actions and what happens to you. And like I said, Chris got that phone call. Then we cut to the final scene of the episode. Chris got that phone call about him being mentioned in the indictments from his mom. So he drives to a newsstand. because this is even though there was computers, this is pre-internet day, and he grabs one of the newspapers to see if there's an article about the indictment. He's in there, and this is like Chris. I mean, might as well have won the lottery here. This is the credibility that Chris wants. This is the thing that Chris wants. He's recognized it, and we begin with Chris being haunted and having a nightmare about something he did wrong. And we end with his kind of dream coming true, right? Which is ironic. The nightmare, or the dream he was having about killing Emil Cole and him getting caught, but the dream coming true of him getting the recognition of being a real mobster. And we're going to see how that unfolds here through the rest of the series. Even though Chris got the recognition, though, is it a good thing? And I'm going to leave you on that note. Sometimes when we get recognition, it's not always a good thing. So great episode here. Like I said, season 1, episode 8, The Legend of Tennessee Moltisanti. Great stuff here, FBI Chris. Once again, show notes are in the bio. Shout out to Emerita Cigars. Enjoying one of those today. I actually took the band off already. Mafia Chronicles, Hardcore Italians. Make sure you check them out. Links to the episode and the IMDb info are in there as well. For more great episodes like this, visit Sopranopreneur.com for more episodes about me, or more information about me, MikeVicara.com, and I will see you on the next episode.